For centuries, kings ruled from thrones built on sacrifice, burdened by a fate they never truly chose. Their names echo through history, but behind the shimmering crowns and grand victories was a life few could endure. They carried the weight of nations, shouldered unrelenting pressure, and fought battles that never truly ended, not just against enemies, but against fate itself. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. And ask yourself, would you have survived the price of a crown? The year is 1205. You wake to the scent of damp stone, the distant clang of metal ringing through the air as the castle stirs to life. Somewhere outside, the bells toll the early hour, marking the beginning of another day. But today is different. Today you are king. The realization settles in your chest, heavy, suffocating, far greater than the golden crown resting on the bedside table beside you. Yesterday, you were merely a noble, a son, a leader of men, but not a ruler. Today, the kingdom is yours, and with it, the weight of every choice, every decision, every expectation. A knock at the door, sharp, precise. Your steward enters before you can answer. A thin man, his robes neat, his expression already strained. My lord, the council awaits. No pleasantries. No moment to collect yourself. Power does not wait. You pull yourself from the bed, the stone floor cold beneath your bare feet. Outside, the castle hums with early morning life. Blacksmiths hammering steel, merchants shouting their first bargains, soldiers checking their weapons. But beyond these everyday sounds, beyond the business of survival, something is wrong. The steward moves quickly, hands tucked behind his back as he leads you through the halls. There is unrest in the kingdom. Whispers of resistance, of workers refusing their duties. Not knights, not warlords, but the women of the kingdom. The weavers, the bakers, the mothers, the healers, the foundation of the kingdom itself. And now, they refuse to be silent. You step into the council chamber, the great doors groaning as they swing open. The nobles gathered inside shift at your arrival, some standing in respect, others watching with barely concealed expectation. My lord, one of them says, bowing. Why have urgent matters to discuss? You take your seat at the head of the table. The throne is still waiting for the official coronation. But for now, this is where your reign begins. The discussion begins immediately. Reports of shortages, protests, disruptions in labor. The workers refuse to bake the bread, mend the clothes, tend the fields. An older noble announces. They demand to be heard. A scoff from the opposite end of the table. Ridiculous, Lord Ainsley mutters. If they do not wish to work, then they will stay nothing. You watch. You listen. This is not about laziness or protest. This is about survival. And now, as king, the choice is yours. Do you force them into submission, risk weakening the very structure of the kingdom? Or do you listen, risk appearing weak in the eyes of those who hunger for power? The room waits for your decision. Your crown is heavy, not just in gold, but in expectation. Your reign has begun. You barely get a chance to inhale your first breath of power before the madness begins. The moment the crown touches your head, everyone wants something from you. Your steward practically hauls you out of bed before the sun has even fully risen, listing problems before your brain can catch up. My lord, the council awaits. There is a grain shortage. The roads need repairs. The barons are growing restless. The livestock keeper insists the royal chickens are depressed. Depressed chickens. You have ruled for exactly half a day, and already you are apparently responsible for chicken morale. You groan, dragging yourself up. Being king means no time for sleep, no time for breakfast, and definitely no time to question why chickens suddenly have opinions about their quality of life. The throne room is already full when you arrive. Lords and advisors, whispering behind their sleeves, the tension palpable. They all bow deeply, but not too deeply. They are loyal, but only as loyal as it serves their interests. Lord Ainsley, who has not stopped talking since you entered, is droning on about taxes, land disputes, trade routes. Things that should concern you, but somehow just sound like expensive headaches. And of course, my lord, there is the matter of the rebellion. That gets your attention. The rebellion is growing. Not knights in armor, not peasants with pitchforks, but the women of the kingdom. The bakers, the spinners, the laundresses, the healers. You blink. What exactly are they rebelling against? They refuse to work. An advisor mutters, shifting uncomfortably. A foolish protest. Lord Ainsley scoffs. If they do not wish to bake bread, they shall starve. Others will replace them. Ah, you see, he thinks this is simple, that they can be dismissed, ignored. He is wrong, because already you have noticed something different. The castle halls are quieter. No servants bustling through, no fires lit, no trays of food prepared. The feast hall, normally overflowing with fresh bread, stews, roasted meats, is barren. The nobles dismiss it. They pretend it is a minor inconvenience. But you know better. You rub your temples. Being king means facing problems no one prepared you for. How exactly does one solve a rebellion when the entire functioning of the kingdom depends on the very people rebelling? You exhale. Summon them. The council stirs. Some look surprised. Some look concerned. You wish to meet with them, my lord? Yes. You say. You need answers. You need to know what they want. And, quite frankly, you need breakfast, because if the kitchens remain empty, you are about 5 hours away from making terrible decisions, fueled entirely by hunger. The meeting happens in the great hall. They enter, not warriors, not diplomats. Mothers, bakers, healers, weavers. Women with steady gazes, calloused hands, shoulders that have carried the kingdom without anyone noticing. The leader steps forward. An older woman with silver in her hair, her cloak simple wool, her expression that of someone who has had enough. She bows. Not deeply. Just enough to acknowledge authority, but not enough to appear submissive. You respect that. We will speak plainly, my lord, she says. You nod. For years we have worked. We have fed the kingdom, clothed it, healed it, kept it warm. And now, we are taxed beyond reason. We are expected to labor longer for less. We have reached the point where even the royal chickens are treated with more care than us. You nearly choke. So it wasn't just an exaggeration. The chickens really are getting better treatment. You clear your throat. And if I refuse your demands? The woman's gaze does not waver. Then we stop. The meaning is clear. No bread baked. No clothes mended. No fires lit. No kingdom functioning. The nobles glance at you, waiting for your response. Some sneer. Some look nervous. Because here is the truth. The kingdom does not run on gold, nor swords, nor laws. It runs on the hands that have built it. You inhale deeply, letting the moment weigh itself out. Then let us negotiate. And then with those words, your reign truly begins. The great hall is tense. Your words, then let us negotiate, have settled into the air, thick and heavy. The rebellion leaders stand firm, their expressions unreadable, waiting to see if you truly mean what you say, or if you are simply another king who speaks in empty promises. Meanwhile, the nobles are losing their collective minds.
My lord, this is outrageous!
Lord Ainsley exclaims, veins nearly popping out of his forehead. Negotiate. With workers. With bakers. What madness is this? The kingdom cannot function under such weakness. Another chimes in, hands thrown up as if you just announced you were replacing the entire army with trained pigeons. You must force them back to work. You take a slow breath. It is far too early for this. Being king means endless demands, endless opinions, endless complaints, and none of them come with simple solutions. But what choice do you have? Option A7. Crush the rebellion, force the workers back into submission, and risk the consequences of half your kingdom, slowly sabotaging everything out of pure spite. Option B. Try to compromise, risk appearing weak, and spend the next several weeks drowning in noble complaints and political backlash. Neither are good options. You rub your temples. This is why kings go grey before 40. Enough, you say, cutting through the noise. The nobles fall silent, but barely. You turn back to the workers. You have my attention. What exactly do you propose? The leader steps forward, eyes sharp. Fair wages, lower grain taxes, better working conditions, and recognition that without us your kingdom falls. You exhale slowly, and if I refuse, then we stop, she says simply. No bread, no clothing, no fires lit, no kingdom. The nobles exchange furious glances. They are expecting you to wave a hand, demand obedience. Put an end to this nonsense with the stroke of a royal decree. But you are not an idiot. If you force them back into labor without addressing the cause, resentment will fester. Small acts of rebellion will turn into larger ones. Accidents will suddenly become too frequent. Crops will mysteriously fail. You lean back in your chair, running a hand across the gold trim of the armrest. If I agree to these terms, what guarantees do I have that the kingdom will return to order? The leader does not blink. Because we want this kingdom to survive, my lord, she says. We do not seek destruction, we seek fairness. It is a rare moment, honest words, without the usual sugar, coating of noble speech. You could reject them outright. That would be the expected course. That would keep your standing among the nobles intact. Or you could do what no king before you has done. Actually fix the mess, instead of making it worse. You take a long breath. You already know your decision. Then let's begin the negotiations. Sue immediate chaos. The nobles erupt into argument. Several shouting over one another, a few looking genuinely horrified. As though you just announced you were replacing taxes with a system of randomly selected sheep donations. Lord Ainsley looks moments away from fainting. You can't be serious, my lord. You are. And now, the real battle begins. Not with swords, but with politics. The council chamber is now less of a political discussion and more of a chaotic mess. Lords are arguing. Advisors are visibly sweating. And somewhere in the back, a noble has dropped his goblet in sheer horror. Negotiate? And go out today? Lord Ainsley sputters, his face turning a shade that suggests he's either moments away from a dramatic faint or from combusting entirely. My lord, you cannot be serious. Oh, but you are. And unfortunately for Ainsley and his merry band of noble outrage, this kingdom doesn't run on their exaggerated gasps and pearl clutching. It runs on the hands of the very people currently refusing to work. The rebellion leaders sit opposite you, their expressions painfully neutral, as they wait for the latest round of noble dramatics to die down. You tap your fingers against the armrest of your throne. Being king is hard, but this is just absurd. Enough, you say, and the noise dies instantly. You fix Ainsley with a flat look. Unless you have an alternative that isn't hope the bread bakes itself, we are negotiating. Ainsley looks personally offended by the suggestion that his grand political strategy of ignore the problem and hope it goes away might not actually be effective. The rebellion leader, an older woman with a stare sharp enough to make even the bravest knight rethink his life choices, leans forward. "Our demands are simple, my lord," she says. "Fair wages, lower grain taxes, better conditions for labourers. Simple. Direct. Infuriating to every noble in this room." You glance at Lord Hargrove, who has spent the last 10 minutes glaring at the rebellion leaders with the kind of disdain usually reserved for finding a rat in your soup. You realize if we accept these terms, it will upset the balance of power, Hargrove mutters. You raise a brow. If we don't, it will upset the balance of the food supply. That shuts him up. Because really, how long can the nobility survive on stubbornness and overpriced wine alone? And so, negotiations begin. The first issue is grain taxes. Grain prices have increased due to drought. An advisor points out, lowering taxes will strain the treasury. The rebellion leader folds her arms. And raising them will strain the people. Do you expect families to eat coins instead? The room goes quiet. Several nobles glance at you, hoping you have some royal solution that somehow makes this problem vanish. Unfortunately, being king does not grant the magical ability to conjure infinite food. You sigh. If we lower the tax on grain, can we make up the loss elsewhere? Perhaps by adjusting trade tariffs. Another advisor offers hesitantly. Ainsley mutters something about how trade tariffs are already a nightmare and how the merchants are just waiting for an excuse to complain even more than usual. Because, apparently, there is not a single problem in this kingdom that does not create 5 more problems. Fine, you say, rubbing your temple. We will reduce the grain tax slightly. Enough to ease the burden without collapsing the treasury. And we will revisit trade negotiations. The rebellion leader nods in approval. The nobles grumble but do not object. First victory secured. Next issue, wages. If we raise wages for labourers, the nobility will have to pay more for services. A particularly whiny lord complains. Yes, the rebellion leader replies flatly. That is the point. You watch the nobles sputter in indignation, as if this is the most offensive suggestion ever made in the history of ruling. You pinch the bridge of your nose. If wages are raised gradually, can the nobility absorb the cost without major economic fallout? Only if spending habits adjust accordingly, an advisor answers. You glance at the nobles, men who regularly throw feasts that involve gold, plated ducks, and imported spices worth more than a small village, and very much doubt their ability to adjust spending. Hargrove mutters under his breath. You expect us to budget? Yes, you reply simply. He looks personally betrayed. But it's happening. The wages will be raised. Gradually, carefully, but enough to matter. And then, the final demand. Recognition, the rebellion leader states firmly. An official decree acknowledging the vital role of labourers in this kingdom. You blink. That's it. That's it, she confirms. You look at the nobles. This is somehow the demand that has caused the most distress. An official decree. Ainsley echoes in disbelief, as if you were asked to build a second castle out of solid gold using only spoons. My lord, this is dangerous. How? You ask dryly. Because if we acknowledge their contributions, they will expect more. Oh, no. The absolute horror of people realizing their work matters. How tragic, you exhale. Fine, draft the decree. And just like that, the rebellion is over. Congratulations, Your Majesty. You have survived negotiations. But now comes the real nightmare. The political fallout, the noble grumbling, the never-ending complaints from every single person who thinks they deserved a different outcome. And worst of all, after hours of fighting nobles, debating policies, and dealing with the sheer nonsense of medieval politics, you still haven't had breakfast. Being king is impossible. You wake up, and everything is already on fire. Not literally, probably. You're not entirely sure yet. But as your steward bursts into your chambers, his expression suggests disaster. My lord, it's the nobles. They are. He hesitates, searching for a word that fully encompasses the sheer level of unhinged political nonsense happening right now. Finally, he sighs and settles on, furious. Well, that didn't take long. It's been 2 days since the rebellion negotiations, and already half the nobility wants your head on a platter. Not because you burned down a village, insulted their ancestors, or declared war on the wrong kingdom. No, no, no. This is far worse. You made them adjust their spending habits. You lowered their grain profits. You suggested that they maybe not host feasts that involve entire roasted peacocks stuffed with smaller roasted birds, stuffed with even tinier, extremely confused birds, and now they want revenge. You groan as you rise, rubbing your temple as your steward hurriedly fixes your cloak, muttering something about preparing for war, which is never a sentence you want to hear before breakfast. Is it actual war or just political nonsense? You ask, shuffling toward the throne room. Political nonsense, he answers grimly. So the worst kind of war, you conclude. And he does not disagree. The throne room is a disaster. Your council is arguing. Nobles are dramatically gesturing, like they're auditioning for a royal tragedy, and someone has spilled wine all over the official treasury documents. You take your seat, adjusting the crown. The cursed, heavy thing that has somehow managed to make every single day of rulership absolute agony. All right. You sigh, drumming your fingers against the armrest. What fresh disaster awaits me today? A noble slams a fist against the table. My lord, you have robbed us of our right to prosperity. You blink. I literally did no such thing. The grain tax adjustment has wounded our lands, another noble shouts. Our trade profits are suffering. I had to cancel my annual feast featuring imported spices, worth more than my entire castle. Oh, no. How tragic. You stare at them, unimpressed. So, you say, tone dry. What I'm hearing is that my attempt to keep the entire kingdom functioning has personally inconvenienced your ability to eat extremely expensive poultry. Do I have that correct? Several nobles falter. That is an oversimplification, one mutters. Is it? You reply flatly. Lord Ainsley clears his throat, looking as though he'd rather be anywhere else right now. My lord, he says carefully, we understand your reasoning, but the nobility cannot simply adapt so suddenly. The entire kingdom has been adapting to your unchecked spending for years. You counter. Several nobles shift uncomfortably. Your steward, bless his patience, leans forward. My lords, what exactly do you propose as a solution? Silence. Because they don't have one. They don't want solutions. They want power back. You inhale deeply. Being king is impossible. Because when the kingdom suffers, you are blamed. And when you try to fix it, you are blamed harder. Fine, you sigh, rubbing your temples. Let's be realistic. Grain tax adjustments will stand. The treasury cannot afford otherwise. Trade routes will be renegotiated, but not at the expense of the lower class starving. If you wish to regain profits, you will. You pause, looking directly at Lord Hargrove, who has been extremely quiet ever since it became clear that he now has to pay workers fairly, not reduce wages, hoard resources, or threaten the stability of this kingdom. Silence. Ainsley is visibly sweating. But my lord, no. And just like that, negotiations end. Congratulations, Your Majesty. You have survived yet another noble tantrum. But of course, your suffering is far from over. Because outside the throne room, yet another disaster awaits. Your steward looks deeply exhausted as he leads you through the castle halls. What now? You sigh? He pauses. Then, heavily, he says, "The royal chickens remain depressed, my lord." You wake up, and disaster has already begun. This time, however, it is not the nobles shrieking about taxes. It is not the treasury collapsing under the weight of excessive feast budgets. It is not even the merchants who have somehow turned mild trade inconvenience into the worst tragedy in recorded history. No, it is worse. It is the royal chickens. Your steward is standing before you with an expression of deep concern, holding a parchment that should never exist. A formal request from the royal livestock keeper, detailing the ongoing crisis of the king's extremely melancholy poultry. My lord. He begins cautiously. The chickens remain depressed. You stare at him. You stare at the words written in ink, as if they somehow make less sense than the last time they were spoken aloud. Why? You ask slowly, because you do not know how to process this information. Hear the chickens depressed. Your steward, God's bless him, is somehow prepared for this question. It seems they lack proper enrichment. Their coop conditions have worsened, and their feed quality has declined. Morale is at an all-time low. Morale. You have ruled for less than a month, and somehow you are being asked to personally solve poultry morale issues. You inhale deeply, rubbing your temples. Being king is impossible. Fine, you say. Fix the conditions, improve their feed, solve the morale problem, whatever that means. Just handle it. Your steward nods, relieved, and rushes off to personally oversee what will now be known as the Royal Chicken Restoration Project. You barely have time to recover from the poultry crisis before the next disaster arrives. And this one, as always, involves the nobility being completely useless. The moment you step into the throne room, the shouting begins. My lord, the roads have become treacherous. My merchants are unable to travel. Bandits plague our trade routes. If this continues, my silk imports will suffer. Of course, it always comes back to silk imports. You exhale slowly. Have the guards increased patrols? Yes, my lord, but the bandits grow bolder. It is as if they know we lack the forces to push them out entirely. Fantastic. You love when criminals have efficiency strategies. How many men would be required to handle the issue? You ask, bracing yourself. 100, perhaps more. You resist the urge to throw your crown across the room in frustration. We do not have 100 spare men. You point out, because apparently no one else in this kingdom has considered that detail. Then what shall we do, my lord? You inhale deeply. Being king is impossible. If you send men to clear the roads, your military strength weakens. If you leave the roads unguarded, trade collapses. And if trade collapses, the nobles would absolutely riot about their imported spices. Fine, you say at last. We will send 30 men to reinforce patrols and reorganize local defenses. The remaining forces will focus on securing food transport to prevent shortages. My lord, 30 men will hardly. Unless you can summon additional soldiers from thin air. That is what we have. You interrupt sharply. Silence. Because again, somehow, you are the only one thinking about the logistics. 2 days later, the Treasury Secretary arrives at your door. And this, unfortunately, means another disaster. My lord, he begins, already looking exhausted. The Treasury has received an unusual request. It concerns. He hesitates, because even he cannot believe what he is about to say. The royal entertainers. You close your eyes for a brief moment, preparing for the nonsense. It appears they have begun. Demanding contracts. You stare. Contracts. A's. In written agreements. Yes, my lord. A fantastic. Even the jesters now require legally binding documents. You sigh, rubbing your temples. Why? It appears they wish for more security in their roles. They have concerns over compensation. And of course, this is happening. Because apparently, even the entertainers are deeply invested in medieval economic stability. Fine, you say, resigned. Draft standard agreements that guarantee fair wages, protection from arbitrary dismissal, and basic benefits. Have the Treasury oversee the process. The secretary looks deeply relieved, because even he did not know how to process this nonsense. Congratulations, Your Majesty. You have now survived a noble tantrum over trade routes, a military logistics nightmare, a paltry morale crisis, and the legal demands of jesters. And somehow, despite solving every issue, you already know that tomorrow will bring more. Because being king is impossible. It is midday, and the castle is already in chaos. You have survived noble complaints, logistical nightmares, and the historic moment in which medieval jesters began demanding contracts. You take exactly 3 seconds to breathe before yet another crisis arrives. And this time, it's your royal guard. My lord, we have a problem. Your captain announces, bowing deeply. You do not trust those words. What kind of problem? You ask, because you already know that no answer will be good. The training grounds have fallen into disrepair. Of course. You glance out toward the barracks, where you can now clearly see a section of fencing that has absolutely collapsed, along with several practice dummies that have been reduced to glorified splinters. You inhale deeply. Being king is impossible. How bad is it? You ask. Your captain hesitates, which is never a good sign. We may have lost 2 horses in the mess. Lost. You echo. They ran off when the structure collapsed. A fantastic. You love when the kingdom spontaneously loses horses. Do we have a plan to repair the grounds and retrieve the horses? Yes, my lord. But the treasury is already stretched thin, and the noble council has delayed the approval for additional funds. And of course they have. Because why approve necessary expenses when you could just make the king suffer instead? You sigh heavily. Use temporary reinforcements for the training area. Prioritize horse retrieval and reorganize budget allocations to ensure future repairs are handled. As you command. My lord, you have barely resolved the royal horse escape incident before the next issue arrives. And this time, it is your court musicians. You already know this will be ridiculous. My lord, the castle's musicians have made a request. You stare at your steward. Why do they need anything? They have concerns regarding instrument upkeep, my lord. Of course. Because even medieval musicians are apparently in a permanent state of crisis. Their instruments require maintenance and replacement, but the budget does not account for regular repairs. They have suggested implementing an organized system. You take a slow breath. So, what you're telling me, you say, is that if I do not address this, we will have a royal court featuring entirely broken instruments. Your steward nods grimly. A tragedy. My lord, you pinch the bridge of your nose. Fine. Establish a maintenance fund. Have the treasury oversee instrument upkeep, so I am never forced to listen to a lute in its final moments. The request is handled. The treasury looks exhausted, and now you are somehow responsible for medieval instrument care management. Being king is impossible. Congratulations, Your Majesty. You have now rescued your own training grounds from collapse, sent knights to recover lost royal horses, established a medieval instrument repair system, And yet, you still have not eaten. Just as you consider escaping the madness, for even 5 minutes, your steward arrives with another disaster. My lord, the noble council requests an audience. Of course they do. Because you have only suffered 6 hours today, and that is simply not enough. You barely have time to recover from the royal training ground collapse, the lost horses, and the medieval instrument repair fund before the noble council arrives with yet another crisis. This time, it's about furniture. You swear you are not making this up. My lord, Ansley announces, looking far too serious for what is about to be said. We have received complaints regarding the state of noble seating arrangements. You blink. Seating arrangements. Yes, my lord. A's in chairs? Wes. You exhale slowly. Being king is impossible. Apparently, some nobles are upset that their personal chamber chairs are less grand than those of others. Some have complained that the wood quality is not sufficient. And, most ridiculously, one particularly dramatic noble has written an official request for throne adjacent seating because he feels his rank is deserving of a chair that is not merely ordinary. You stare at the council. You stare at Lord Ainsley, who somehow has the audacity to look as though this matter is worth your time. Do you truly expect me to solve the noble chair crisis? You ask flatly. My lord, seating hierarchy is a matter of great importance. It is a matter of absolute nonsense. Silence. Ainsley opens his mouth. You raise a hand to stop him. Handle this without my involvement. If I am forced to personally oversee chair disputes, I will order every noble to sit on the floor. Ainsley looks personally attacked, but wisely does not argue. One crisis avoided. But, of course, the nonsense is far from over. The moment Ainsley exits to solve medieval furniture hierarchy, your steward enters with yet another disaster. My lord, he sighs, already tired. There is an issue with the royal wine supply. You sigh right back at him. Of course there is. Apparently, the latest wine imports have been delayed due to faulty barrels, causing major supply shortages. And because nobles cannot function without their excess, this has led to dramatic accusations that wine transporters are attempting to overthrow the kingdom. You pinch the bridge of your nose. Are we seriously discussing a noble conspiracy theory over barrels? Your steward looks painfully exhausted. Yes, my lord, you inhale deeply. Being king is impossible. Fine. Investigate the supplier, ensure quality control, and reassure the nobles that they are not being personally attacked by wooden containers. Understood, my lord. Congratulations, Your Majesty. You have now resolved the noble chair dispute without committing treason. Prevented a wine-related political collapse. Saved your sanity for now. But of course, you still have not eaten. And just as you begin to contemplate basic survival, your steward arrives with yet another disaster. My lord, the court falconer has arrived. A fantastic. Because you love when falcons need diplomatic intervention. For all the madness, intrigue, and exhaustion that comes with kingship, there was one ruler who didn't just survive the burden. He thrived under it, shaping the very foundation of Europe itself. Charlemagne. Born in 742, he was not merely another king struggling against the tide of nobility, wars, and political nonsense. He was the architect of an empire, the Carolingian Empire, that would unite vast territories, redefine rulership, and spark a renaissance of learning and religious reform. Crowned Emperor of the Romans in 800 AD, Charlemagne did what few had successfully attempted before. He brought together fractured kingdoms, stabilized governance, and left a legacy that would endure far beyond his reign. But how did he rise to such power? What made his rule different from the countless medieval kings who floundered under the pressures of nobility and governance. To understand Charlemagne's greatness, we must go back to the beginning. His rise, his conquests, and his transformation from a Frankish king into the ruler of an empire. Charlemagne's rise was neither swift nor effortless. Born in 742 to the ruling Carolingian dynasty, his early years were marked by the complexities of Frankish politics. His father, Pepin the Short, had already begun consolidating power, removing the last Merovingian king and securing papal support for his family's claim to the throne. When Pepin died in 768, Charlemagne and his brother Carloman inherited the kingdom. But divided rule rarely lasts, and when Carloman died suddenly in 771, Charlemagne seized full control, ensuring that no rival factions would challenge his authority. From that moment, his reign became defined by military ambition, political strategy, and a relentless drive to expand his empire. The Frankish kingdom was already powerful, but Charlemagne understood that strength alone would not secure lasting rule. He needed land, loyalty, and the backing of both his nobles and the church. His first major conquest was against the Lombards in 774. The Lombard kingdom, which controlled northern Italy, posed a threat to the papacy, and Charlemagne, eager to strengthen ties with the Pope, invaded. His campaign was swift and decisive. By the end of the year, he had declared himself king of the Lombards, securing not only Italian territory, but also deeper influence within the Catholic Church. Charlemagne was no stranger to prolonged wars. His campaigns against the Saxons stretched over 3 decades. The Saxons, a pagan people occupying the forests and rivers of northern Germany, resisted Frankish rule fiercely. Their lands were difficult to conquer, and their warriors refused to submit, launching repeated uprisings. Every time Charlemagne thought he had secured victory. But Charlemagne was relentless. He ordered mass conversions, built churches across conquered territories, and punished rebellion with merciless force. By 804, the Saxons were defeated, their lands absorbed into his growing empire. The vastness of Charlemagne's kingdom created new challenges. A ruler could not effectively govern an empire stretching across modern-day France, Germany, Italy, and beyond without control over its administration. Charlemagne addressed this by appointing counts to oversee provinces, ensuring that each region remained loyal to the throne. To keep these officials in check, he employed royal inspectors known as missi dominici, who travelled the empire enforcing the king's policies and reporting directly to him. This system of governance was revolutionary, allowing Charlemagne to maintain order across his territories while preventing local rulers from growing too powerful. Charlemagne's crowning achievement came in 800 AD, when Pope Leo III declared him Emperor of the Romans. The ceremony took place in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, a moment rich with symbolism. It tied Charlemagne to the legacy of ancient Rome, elevating his status beyond that of a mere Frankish king. With this title, he became the most powerful ruler in Western Europe, the protector of Christendom, and the man responsible for shaping medieval European politics for centuries to come. But his rule was not just about conquest and titles. Charlemagne understood the importance of education and sought to improve literacy and learning throughout his empire. He invited scholars to his court, encouraged the copying of classical texts, and implemented reforms that improved the administration of monasteries and schools. His efforts sparked what would later be known as the Carolingian Renaissance, a revival of intellectual and artistic culture that preserved knowledge at a time when Europe could easily have fallen into deeper stagnation. By the time of his death in 814, Charlemagne had transformed Europe, His empire was vast, his influence undeniable. Though his successors struggled to maintain his legacy, the foundations he laid would shape the course of medieval history, defining the structure of European rule and the relationship between kings and the church for generations. His reign was a rare example of medieval kingship, not descending into disaster, but instead forging a path towards stability, learning, and empire. While ruling was never easy, Charlemagne proved that with the right ambition, strategy, and ruthlessness, a king could not just survive, but reshape an entire continent. The year 1066 was a turning point for England. When King Edward the Confessor died without an heir, the kingdom was thrown into uncertainty. Harold Godwinson, a powerful English noble, seized the throne, but his claim was immediately challenged by two rulers with ambitions far greater than mere titles. Among them was William, Duke of Normandy, a man determined to make England his own by force, if necessary. William had spent years securing Normandy, building a formidable military, and ensuring his vassals remained loyal. He was not merely a warrior. He was a strategist, understanding that legitimacy was not just taken but crafted. He claimed that Edward had promised him the English throne, and when Harold dismissed his claim, William knew that diplomacy would not resolve the matter. War was inevitable. With his army assembled, he crossed the English Channel, landing in September 1066. The Battle of Hastings, fought on October 14, was decisive. Harold's forces were strong, but William's tactics, his use of feigned retreats, his heavy cavalry, and his relentless assaults, proved too much. By the end of the day, Harold was dead, and William was the undisputed victor. But conquest was only the beginning. England was far from stable, and William understood that keeping power would be harder than taking it. Resistance simmered across the kingdom, especially in the north. Anglo-Saxon lords refused to surrender easily, and uprisings broke out as soon as William attempted to impose Norman rule. His response was brutal. He led the harrying of the north, Tun 69 Run 7 a scorched earth campaign that devastated rebellious regions, burning villages, slaughtering livestock, and crushing any remaining opposition. England would submit, whether willingly or through sheer force. William knew that conquest alone was not enough. England had to be remade to serve Norman interests. He introduced feudalism, replacing Anglo-Saxon landowners with loyal Norman barons, who pledged allegiance directly to him. Castles rose across the kingdom, not merely as symbols of Norman dominance, but as fortresses securing his hold. He ensured that no noble held too much power, distributing land carefully, so that no lord could challenge his authority. The Anglo-Saxon aristocracy was dismantled, their influence erased. Governance required structure, and William was not about to rule blindly. In 1086, he commissioned the Domesday Book, an extensive survey documenting land ownership, livestock, taxes, and resources across England. It was a work of unprecedented detail, ensuring that William knew exactly how much he controlled, how much wealth could be extracted, and how firmly the kingdom was held under his rule. No ruler before him had attempted such meticulous record keeping, and his legacy of administrative control reshaped English governance. By the time of his death in 1087, William had transformed England into a Norman kingdom. His authority was absolute, his landholdings secure, and his influence undeniable. The Anglo-Saxons resisted, but William had won, not just on the battlefield, but in the restructuring of an entire nation. He did not simply conquer, he rebuilt England in his own image. In 1189, a new king took the English throne. His name was Richard I, but history remembers him as Richard the Lionheart. Tall, fair-haired, and fearless in battle. Richard was not your average monarch. In fact, he was hardly a monarch at all. At least, not in the way most kings rule. He spent only 6 months of his 10-year reign in England. The rest, he was chasing glory across deserts and battlefields, thousands of miles from his kingdom. Richard wasn't crowned to sit on a throne. He was born to fight. Just 1 year after becoming king, he led the Third Crusade, a military campaign to reclaim Jerusalem from Saladin, the legendary Muslim leader. What followed was a war of epic clashes and chivalric showdowns. Richard became famous for his boldness, his strategy, and his brutal efficiency. His sword was sharp, but his reputation even sharper. He captured the city of Acre. He led charges into enemy lines. He even negotiated face-to-face with Saladin's brother, despite never meeting Saladin himself in person. But Richard wasn't just a warrior. He was also a showman. He once ordered 700 prisoners executed in a single day, then wrote about it, knowing it would terrify his enemies. Back in England, however, things weren't going so well. While Richard was fighting abroad, his brother John was scheming at home. The kingdom nearly fell into chaos. In 1192, Richard began the long journey home. But fate had other plans. He was captured by the Duke of Austria and held for ransom. England had to pay a massive price, 150,000 marks, nearly bankrupting the kingdom, to bring their absent king back. He returned not as a ruler, but as a legend. Richard the Lionheart died in 1199 from an infected wound during a minor skirmish in France. Not in Jerusalem, not in London, but in a siege over a petty dispute. For a king who barely ruled, Richard left a legacy carved in stone and sung in myth. He was the king who wore a crown, but lived like a crusader. Richard the Lionheart died at the age of 41. A stray crossbow bolt struck his shoulder during a siege in France. The wound festered, and infection set in. Even a king, especially one far from home, was no match for medieval medicine. He died in the arms of his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women in medieval Europe. He was buried in parts. His heart was sent to Rouen in Normandy. His body was laid to rest at Fontevraud Abbey beside his father, Henry II, and his entrails, left at the site of the siege where he fell. A fitting end for a man who never truly belonged to one place. But here's the irony for all his bravery and battlefield glory. Richard wasn't really interested in ruling. He raised taxes to fund his wars. He saw England more as a bank than a homeland. He even said, half-jokingly, that he'd sell the whole country if he could find a buyer. And yet the English adored him. Why? Because Richard became the ideal of what a medieval king should be. Courageous, noble, fierce. He became a legend in his own time, and a myth after his death. Ballads were sung about him. Chronicles praised him. Later kings invoked his name to rally troops and inspire loyalty. Even today, a massive statue of Richard the Lionheart stands outside the Palace of Westminster in London, sword raised, gaze unflinching. But behind the bronze and the stories is a more complicated truth. Richard was a great warrior, but a poor administrator. A hero to his soldiers, but a stranger to his people. He won battles abroad, but left his kingdom vulnerable at home. History remembers him as a lion, but lions don't build kingdoms. They roam. Medieval kings ruled vast territories, commanded armies, and shaped history itself. But for all their power, wealth, and carefully constructed legacies, history had a habit of ensuring that some of them met utterly ridiculous ends. From exploding cannons to unfortunate plumbing incidents, the royal title was no guarantee of a dignified departure. In fact, for many rulers, their deaths became far more legendary than anything they accomplished while alive. Consider King James II of Scotland. a ruler known for his military ambitions. His reign was filled with sieges, battles, and a relentless pursuit of expanding his kingdom's power. But for all his strategy, for all his careful planning, one thing he did not plan for was a cannon deciding it had had enough. The year was 1460, and James was leading a siege against Roxburgh Castle. He was excited. Too excited, perhaps, about his brand new artillery, eager to see his powerful new siege weapons in action. But as he stood close to observe, history decided it had other plans. The cannon, a massive and heavily loaded weapon, exploded instead of firing properly. In an instant, shrapnel tore through the air, and James, who had survived the political turmoil of ruling Scotland, was wiped out by his own enthusiasm for technology. He had not been ambushed. He had not fallen in battle. He had not been poisoned by scheming nobles. No, he was betrayed by a malfunctioning cannon. And yet, his death was far from the most humiliating royal ending in history. Because while James was undone by military innovation gone wrong, others were destroyed by circumstances far stranger. And sometimes much, much worse. Take King Edward VI of England. His reign was a disaster, a mess of political failures, noble rebellions, and truly terrible decision-making. By the end of it, his enemies had completely run out of patience. His own wife, Isabella, conspired to overthrow him alongside her lover, Roger Mortimer. The coup was successful, and Edward found himself imprisoned. But dethroning him wasn't enough. He had to be removed permanently. And that is where things got extremely suspicious, because while medieval rulers had a habit of dying in dramatic ways, whether by poison, battle, or sudden illness, Edward's alleged death was so graphic and bizarre that historians still argue over what actually happened. According to some extremely gleeful medieval chroniclers, Edward VII was murdered by his captors in 1327 using a red, hot poker. Yes, a poker. And not in the way one would expect. The tale goes that his assassins, wanting to avoid obvious signs of murder, used the poker in the most horrifying possible way, burning him from the inside to leave no trace. Now, does this sound suspiciously dramatic? Yes. Does it sound like something medieval writers would exaggerate for entertainment? Also yes. Many historians today suspect Edward was simply strangled or quietly removed in another way, with the poker story possibly being propaganda designed to make his death as humiliating as possible. Either way, Edward did not go out with dignity. And speaking of undignified royal situations, medieval kings had another issue to contend with: toilets. While the average person in medieval Europe made do with chamber pots or makeshift latrines, castles had actual built-in toilet systems known as garderobes. These were little enclosed spaces with a hole, positioned above a pit, or flowing water to carry waste away. In theory, this was an upgrade from just throwing waste into the streets. In reality, it was a nightmare. Cold drafts constantly blew up from the pits. Some garderobes were directly over castle walls, meaning an unfortunate gust of wind could turn an already bad situation into a disaster. And in truly horrifying moments, there are records of people, yes, actual people, falling into these waste pits and dying in the most unpleasant way possible. In 1184, Prince Geoffrey of Anjou met his end, when the floor beneath his garderobe collapsed, sending him straight down into the sewer system. Imagine the indignity, the legacy, the sheer unfairness of surviving medieval politics, only to be betrayed by terrible plumbing. But plumbing was far from the worst fate medieval rulers suffered. Because while some were killed by siege weapons, burned alive by medieval conspiracies, or destroyed by failing castle architecture, others had the misfortune of dying in ways so absurd that they read like bad comedy. Take King Adolf Frederick of Sweden, who, in 1771, died after eating too much dessert. Yes, he ate himself to death. A grand meal, followed by 14 servings of semla, sweet pastry filled with almond paste and cream, left him so overwhelmingly full that his body simply gave up. For a man who ruled Sweden, his greatest battle was apparently against his own digestive system, and he lost. And then there was Sigurd Eysteinsson, the Viking ruler of Orkney, who died because of teeth, not his own teeth. That would be too normal. No. Sigurd was killed by the teeth of an enemy he had already defeated. After slaying his foe in battle, Sigurd decided to tie the man's severed head to his saddle as a trophy. Unfortunately, he forgot that teeth are sharp. The head bounced against Sigurd's leg as he rode, causing a deep wound that became infected. Days later, he was dead. So, in summary, some kings conquered entire kingdoms, only to be undone by exploding cannons. Some kings fell from power and were possibly murdered in ways designed to ensure no one ever took them seriously again. Some fell into toilets, and some were defeated by pastries and teeth. For all their power, wealth, and military strength, history made one thing clear: being king was never safe, never simple, and often deeply, deeply ridiculous. Medieval rulers had everything: power, wealth, armies at their command, castles full of questionable plumbing. They controlled entire kingdoms, shaped history, and dictated the fate of nations. And yet, despite their grand titles, some of them met the most absurd, humiliating, and downright ridiculous ends imaginable. If ruling was difficult, dying as a king was often even worse. There was no guarantee of a dignified departure. One could prepare for war, defend against treason, avoid poisoned wine at feasts, and still, somehow, be betrayed by a cheese wheel, a stubborn curtain, or an exceptionally bad case of overeating. Because history never forgets when kings die stupidly. And unfortunately for them, neither do we. Charles Vetou of France was the kind of king who had grand ambitions, who dreamed of conquest and expanding his influence across Europe. He led military campaigns in Italy, seeking to claim vast territories, to carve his name into history as a warrior king. But for all his battles, for all his victories and losses, he was undone by a doorway. Yes, a doorway. In 1498, Charles was walking through his castle in Amboise when he smacked his head on a particularly low lintel. Not in battle, not in an assassination attempt, just walking. At first, it seemed like an embarrassing but harmless mistake. But medieval healthcare was about as reliable as a drunk scribe trying to count taxes, and hours later, Charles collapsed. Soon after, he was dead. One moment, he was ruler of France, determined to make history. The next, he was the cautionary tale of why architecture should be properly measured. King George II of Great Britain ruled during a time of great political shifts, colonial expansions, and dynastic rivalries. He presided over wars, crafted diplomatic strategies, and ensured that Britain remained a formidable power. And yet, for all his statecraft, for all his maneuvering in European politics, he died in the single most embarrassing way possible, while straining himself on the toilet. The year was 1760, and George, much like any mortal man, had to attend to nature's calls. Unfortunately, something went terribly wrong, and the strain proved far too much for his body to handle. One moment, he was King of Great Britain, ruler of the colonies, master of diplomacy. The next, he was a very unfortunate statistic in toilet-related tragedies. If history teaches us anything, it's that no amount of royal power can protect against terrible timing. And then there was King Alexander of Greece, who met his end thanks to monkeys. Not a traitor with a dagger, not a battlefield ambush, monkeys. In 1920, Alexander was strolling in his palace gardens when his dog got into a fight with a group of monkeys. Naturally, as any devoted pet owner would, he stepped in to break up the chaos. Bad idea. One of the monkeys bit him badly, causing an infection that spiraled into something much worse. Doctors hesitated, debated, and delayed, unsure how to treat the wound effectively. And before long, he was dead, his entire rule undone by a monkey brawl. Which raises the very important historical question: was this an assassination, or just the single worst case of bad luck in royal history? Either way, the monkeys won. And finally, there was King Charles Secure of Navarre, who died in a way so deeply unfortunate that medieval chroniclers must have struggled not to laugh while writing it down. By the time of his death in 1387, Charles was suffering from illness. His physicians, naturally, were prepared to treat him in the most advanced medieval way possible, which meant doing something completely insane. To help his failing health, they decided to wrap him entirely in brandy-soaked cloths. The logic behind this treatment is unknown, because it was a terrible plan. A servant, after wrapping the king, accidentally dropped a candle. The cloths immediately caught fire, and thus King Charles Secure of Navarre, ruler of lands, commander of men, was reduced to nothing but ash thanks to medical malpractice and medieval fabric choices. The lesson: kings were not immune to tragic stupidity. No matter how grand their titles, some were defeated by furniture, monkeys, toilets, candles, or even their own overly ambitious feast portions. History remembers their kingdoms, their battles, their legacies, but it also remembers when rulers go out in the most ridiculous way possible. Medieval history, for all its grandeur and nobility, is full of kings who met truly absurd ends. Some fell in battle, others were undone by conspiracies, but a special few managed to leave this world in ways that make historians pause, sigh, and wonder if fate itself had a sense of humor. One such king was Frederick I, Holy Roman Emperor, a ruler who had spent decades solidifying his reign, fighting wars, and exerting dominance over Europe. A man known for his military prowess, his authority, and his sheer force of will. And yet, he drowned in a river, not in the middle of a battle, not while escaping enemy forces. No, Frederick's legendary rule ended because he tried to cross a stream and forgot that heavy armor and swimming do not mix. The year was 1190, and Frederick was leading the Third Crusade, ready to march upon Jerusalem and reclaim the Holy Land. He had fought countless battles, commanded thousands of men, and was determined to leave his mark on history. Then, one day, he decided to ride across the Salef River. It was not a particularly dangerous river, but Frederick, dressed in his full suit of armor, made a fatal miscalculation. He fell. And because medieval plate armor is notoriously terrible for mobility, he could not resurface. Within moments, one of Europe's most powerful rulers was defeated by a shallow river, proving that no amount of military strategy can counteract bad physics. Another royal misfortune came for King Henry I of England, who met his untimely end thanks to his love for seafood. Henry ruled England at a time of deep political struggles, constantly battling nobles, securing borders, and ensuring that his dynasty remained intact. His reign had seen wars, betrayals, and intense negotiations, but it was a plate of lampreys that finally destroyed him. Lampreys, for those unfamiliar, are terrifying, eel-like creatures with circular mouths full of teeth, often regarded as an acquired taste. Henry, unfortunately, acquired too much of them. He ate an excessive amount of lampreys during a feast, despite repeated warnings that perhaps consuming so many of these horrifying creatures was a terrible idea. And sure enough, his health rapidly deteriorated, leading to his death in 1135. Some kings die in battle. Some kings die through assassination. Henry I died because he did not understand portion control. Speaking of tragic royal dining decisions, there was King Charles V of France, whose final moments were the direct result of walking through a doorway too quickly. Charles was not an insignificant ruler. He had fought wars, ruled over France with ambition, and played a significant role in shaping European politics. Then, one day in 1498, he walked straight into a low doorway. The impact was hard, too hard. At first, he laughed it off. Then, hours later, he collapsed and died. One moment, he was the ruler of France, shaping the course of nations. The next, the victim of poor castle architecture. But no king suffered a worse fate than King Martin of Aragon, who met his end not through war, treachery, or sickness, but through laughter. The year was 1410, and Martin had just finished an impossibly large feast. Too much food, too much wine. The kind of indulgence that only medieval rulers could afford. Satisfied with his meal, he asked his jester for entertainment. The jester, eager to impress, told Martin an absurd joke about a deer. Martin laughed. Too much. In fact, he laughed so hard that he was unable to stop, gasping for air until he literally collapsed from his own amusement. That was it. A deer joke ended the reign of a king. It was not treason. It was not battle. It was a bad punchline. History remembers the great rulers, the warlords, the legendary conquerors. But history also remembers when fate decides to play a joke on the throne. Some kings died fighting for their kingdoms. Others were undone by rivers, bad seafood, doorway placement, and truly unfortunate comedy timing. No matter how powerful, no matter how ambitious, not a single ruler could escape the sheer ridiculousness that medieval history had waiting for them. Medieval rulers may have commanded armies, shaped nations, and dictated the fate of their kingdoms. But many of them had one baffling belief in common: bathing was dangerous. To the modern mind, the idea that royal hygiene consisted of avoiding water at all costs sounds like an elaborate joke. But medieval kings genuinely feared baths. Some believed they would weaken the body. Others were convinced that excessive washing would lead to disease, and a special few just hated the idea of being submerged in water entirely. So, naturally, they resorted to alternatives. And by alternatives, I mean perfume. Not bathing. Splash some scented oils on it and hope no one notices. Clothes unwashed for weeks. Douse them in floral essence and pray the stench is masked. The royal court, meanwhile, had no choice but to suffer in silence, because medieval etiquette did not allow you to openly gag in front of the king. Some rulers took this anti-hygiene policy to extremes. Louis IV, though technically beyond the medieval era, was notorious for avoiding baths altogether. He famously claimed to have only bathed twice in his entire life, which raises far too many questions about the survival of his attendants. But earlier medieval kings were not much better. In fact, many of them believed water carried disease, and that the safest way to stay healthy was to never wash too often. Instead, they relied on changing their linens, assuming that fresh clothing magically removed filth from the body. Of course, this did not work. It merely created entire rooms full of heavily perfumed people, slowly suffocating under layers of trapped odor. The royal court had no escape from the consequences. Imagine sitting through long councils, diplomatic meetings, royal feasts, all while surrounded by a collection of unwashed monarchs and nobles, each drenched in oils and scents that desperately attempted to hide the fact that no one had bathed in weeks. Sure, political crises were stressful, but surviving medieval court life without fainting from sheer olfactory assault, that was the real challenge. Medieval hygiene was less about actual cleanliness and more about creative problem solving in a world that feared water. Since many rulers believed bathing would make them sick, they perfected the art of smelling clean while remaining absolutely filthy, which is a skill no one should need. But here we are. Royal perfume was not just a luxury, it was a survival tactic. Instead of washing, kings and nobles drenched themselves in oils, floral extracts, musks, and spices, hoping that the sheer strength of their chosen scent would mask the deep betrayal of never touching soap. Attending court became an endurance test for everyone involved. Imagine sitting for hours in a crowded throne room, surrounded by a collection of unwashed aristocrats, each fiercely committed to hiding their odor under layers of heavy fabric and excessive perfumes. People couldn't just gasp in horror when the air became unbearable. That would be rude. So instead, they endured, adapted, and possibly developed entirely new breathing techniques just to survive royal functions. But it wasn't just perfume that kept medieval rulers clinging to their deeply flawed hygiene theories. Some believed that linen clothing absorbed filth directly from the skin, meaning all one had to do was change outfits frequently, rather than actually washing. It was a truly ambitious assumption, one that led to a kingdom filled with crisp, well-dressed nobles who had not touched water in weeks. Science did not support this approach, but medieval rulers fully committed. And then there was the tragedy of royal dental care. Since brushing wasn't exactly common practice, some rulers resorted to rubbing their teeth with herbs or rinsing their mouths with wine, convinced that the alcohol would handle any problems. The result? Generations of monarchs with aggressively bad breath, ensuring that any close conversation was equal parts diplomacy and silent suffering for the person standing too near. Some even believed that chewing cloves or cinnamon could permanently prevent tooth decay, which sounds both ambitious and incredibly wrong. In short, royal hygiene was an elaborate mess. Edward III was not a man who did things halfway. If he was going to rule, he would rule magnificently. If he was going to wage war, it would be the longest war in history. And if he was going to secure England's place on the map, he would make sure no one ever forgot his name. His reign was defined by ambition, military innovation, and a very questionable claim to the French throne that somehow escalated into a war that lasted over a century. He was strategic, ruthless, and, perhaps most importantly, the kind of king who believed that fighting France was simply a great way to pass the time. It all started with a succession crisis, because medieval France, much like medieval England, had a habit of making royal inheritance more complicated than necessary. When the French king, Charles IV, died in 1328, Edward III saw an opportunity. His mother was a French princess, making him the grandson of Philip IV, and therefore, at least in his mind, the rightful king of France. France, unsurprisingly, disagreed. They picked another ruler, Philip VI, and politely told Edward to mind his own kingdom. Edward's response: war. Thus began the 100 Years' War, a conflict that would drag on for generations, ruin countless economies, shift the balance of power, and generally make medieval Europe a very exhausting place to live. Edward was not just aggressive, he was dangerously competent. He understood that England, with its smaller population and fewer resources, had to fight smart. So he leaned on military strategy, employing English longbowmen, fast, deadly, and capable of tearing through French cavalry before they could even engage in combat. The Battle of Crecy in 1346 was a perfect demonstration of this. The French knights, heavily armored and confident, charged forward, expecting a glorious melee battle. Instead, they were absolutely torn apart by waves of arrows before they could even get close. It was humiliating, it was brutal, and it cemented England's reputation for lethal battlefield tactics. But Edward's greatest military asset was his son, Edward, the Black Prince. This was a man who had no interest in subtlety. His campaigns were ruthless, his tactics relentless, and his reputation as a commander bordered on mythological. He led England to some of its greatest victories, crushing French forces at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, capturing their king, and reducing France's morale to absolute rubble. He was admired, feared, and by the end of his career, his name alone was enough to shake enemy forces. Edward III's reign transformed England into a kingdom that was no longer just a European power. It was a military force to be reckoned with. Through war, strategy, and the kind of ambition that would make most rulers hesitate, he reshaped history itself. And the 100 Years' War. It wasn't even over when he died. It kept going, dragging countless rulers into its chaos, proving that when Edward II started something, he made sure it lasted far beyond his own lifetime. The 100 Years' War did not end with Edward III. It dragged on, entangling generations of rulers in its endless cycle of battles, betrayals, and very questionable political decisions. What began as Edward's ambitious attempt to claim the French throne spiraled into a conflict that outlived him, his heirs, and a good chunk of medieval Europe itself. Edward III had set England on a course that could not be easily abandoned. His victories, his military strategies, and his bold claims ensured that future kings would have no choice but to keep fighting. Because retreating from the war now would mean losing everything England had gained. And so the war continued. After Edward II died in 1377, his grandson Richard II inherited the throne. But Richard was not Edward II, and his reign did not share the same strength or strategic brilliance. Instead of expanding England's victories, he spent most of his time failing spectacularly at ruling, leading to his eventual deposition in 1399. But England needed a strong king to continue the war, and that's exactly what they got when Henry V took the throne in 1413. If Edward III had been ambitious, Henry V was unstoppable. He revived England's military dominance, launching one of the most legendary campaigns in medieval history. His defining moment came in 1415, at the Battle of Agincourt, where, despite being vastly outnumbered, his forces absolutely destroyed the French army with superior tactics, discipline, and, once again, those terrifying English longbowmen. The French knights, heavily armoured and proud, charged across a battlefield turned into pure mud from heavy rain. Their horses struggled, their movements slowed, and before they could engage the English, arrows rained down upon them, cutting through their ranks with brutal precision. By the time the battle was over, England stood victorious, and Henry V secured his place as one of the greatest military kings in history. He forced France into a peace treaty so humiliating that the French crown agreed to let him marry their princess and inherit the throne after the French king's death. It was a moment of total dominance. England had won, or at least it seemed that way. Then Henry V died young in 1422, and everything fell apart. His infant son, Henry V, inherited the throne. But Henry V was not a warrior king. He was not ruthless, strategic, or capable of leading England to more victories. He was weak, indecisive, and so ill-equipped for ruling that his reign practically invited disaster. France recovered. Joan of Arc arrived, inspiring the French army, reclaiming lost territory, and proving that England's dominance was not as permanent as they had believed. Soon, English forces were losing. The land they had fought for slipped from their grasp. And finally, In 1453, the war ended. After 116 years, France was victorious, and England was forced to abandon its claim to the throne once and for all. The 100 Years' War had shaped medieval Europe like no other conflict. It had destroyed dynasties, rewritten borders, and evolved military strategy in ways that changed warfare forever. But for all the victories, for all the defeats, one thing remained clear. Edward III had started something that no king after him could escape, ensuring that his legacy, whether in triumph or ruin, would never be forgotten. Basil Sevi did not just rule, he dominated. When he took the Byzantine throne, the empire was powerful but unstable, its borders constantly threatened, its enemies eager for weakness. Basil, however, had no intention of losing ground. His reign was defined by brutal military campaigns, unwavering control, and a single-minded determination to expand and secure Byzantine power at all costs. For nearly 50 years, Basil ruled without distraction. He did not waste time on courtly intrigues or lavish displays of wealth. His empire was his battlefield, and his legacy would be built on conquest, not excess. Basil's greatest conflict, and the one that earned him the terrifying title of the Bulgar Slayer, was his war against the Bulgarian Empire. The Bulgarians, under their ruler Tsar Samuel, had grown into a powerful force, constantly challenging Byzantine rule, raiding territories, and threatening the empire's control over the Balkans. Basil had no patience for this. His war against the Bulgarians was relentless. Over 2 decades, he systematically crushed their forces, pushing deeper into Bulgarian lands, methodically dismantling their ability to resist. And when victory was finally his, he took 15,000 Bulgarian prisoners and blinded them, leaving only one in every 100 with a single eye, so they could lead the others back home in complete humiliation. When Tsar Samuel saw what had become of his army, he collapsed and died, possibly from sheer shock. The Bulgarian Empire was no more. Beyond war, Basil's reign was defined by stability and strength. He expanded the frontiers, fortifying Byzantine control over Asia Minor, the Balkans, and Eastern Europe. He reformed the government, ensuring that nobles did not overpower the imperial system, and most importantly, he ruled without distraction. His singular focus on the empire kept Byzantium strong, ensuring that his legacy would last long after his death. By the time he died in 1025, the Byzantine Empire was at its peak, powerful, stable, and nearly unrivaled in its influence. But Basil's legacy was also ruthless. He was not a ruler known for mercy, nor was he a man who tolerated weakness. His empire was built on military dominance, and when future rulers failed to match his strength, Byzantium would begin its slow decline. Basil had held the empire together with sheer force, but history showed that few rulers after him could maintain that grip for long. Medieval kings met their ends in all sorts of dramatic ways: battle, assassination, terrible medical decisions, and sometimes in ways so absurdly ridiculous that they feel more like bad comedy than real history. But few royal deaths are more tragic and hilarious, at the same time, than the demise of King Martin of Aragon, a man who ate too much, got indigestion, and then laughed himself out of existence. The year was 1410, and Martin was king of a powerful Mediterranean kingdom. By all accounts, he was competent enough at ruling, not particularly remarkable, but not terrible either. He had survived the usual dangers of medieval leadership: betrayal, war, plague, bad dentistry. And then, one evening, he sat down for a grand meal. The goose was plentiful. The portions were excessive. The digestive system was not prepared. Martin, blissfully unaware that this was the beginning of his downfall, overindulged on roast goose, stuffing himself to the point of deep regret. By the time the meal was over, he was suffering from serious indigestion, unable to move comfortably, and absolutely unwilling to engage in anything requiring physical effort. Naturally, since medieval medicine was about as reliable as a drunk knight giving battle tactics, the best treatment was apparently doing absolutely nothing and waiting to feel better. So Martin lay in bed, miserable and full of regret. But then his jester arrived, and here is where history takes a truly bizarre turn. Jesters, of course, had one job: entertain the king. Normally, this meant juggling, singing, or making deeply questionable jokes that no one else in court was brave enough to attempt. On this particular evening, Martin asked his jester for something funny to lift his spirits, perhaps to distract him from the uncomfortable reality of having eaten an entire goose more than he should have. The jester delivered a joke about a deer, something absurd, something so unbelievably idiotic that Martin found himself laughing uncontrollably. And here is where fate decided to intervene. Martin did not stop laughing. It began as a chuckle, then deep amusement, then absolute hysteria. His body, already in distress from digestive ruin, could not handle the laughter. And then he was dead. That was it. The joke had won. The medieval world had seen kings fall in battle, rulers poisoned by rivals, monarchs betrayed by their own families. But Martin of Aragon was defeated by excessive poultry consumption and a deer joke. It was not treason. It was not war. It was death by dad joke. History has not recorded what the joke was. And perhaps that's for the best. Because if a single joke was powerful enough to end a king, no one should risk telling it again. History has a habit of ensuring that some kings meet their end in the absolute worst way possible. While many rulers were cut down in battle, poisoned by rivals, or undone by political disasters, others suffered deaths so absurd that they seem personally designed to humiliate them for all eternity. Take King Adolf Frederick of Sweden, who learned the hard way that there is such a thing as too much dessert. The year was 1771, and Adolf was enjoying a truly excessive meal, one of those grand feasts where the portions defied human reason. He ate lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, smoked herring, champagne, and just when any reasonable person would have stopped, he decided that 14 servings of semla, sweet pastries filled with almond paste and cream, were an excellent idea. 14. His digestive system disagreed. Adolf ate himself into oblivion, his stomach so utterly overwhelmed that he died shortly afterward, proving that sometimes the greatest battle a king faces is against his own appetite. And then there was King Sigurd of Orkney, who met his end thanks to a severed head, but not in the way one would expect. Sigurd had won a great victory, slaying his rival Maia el Bricti, and, feeling victorious, he decided to take his enemy's head as a trophy. Standard medieval intimidation tactics. Then he made a fatal mistake. Instead of properly displaying the head, he tied it to his saddle and rode off. Unfortunately, he forgot that teeth are sharp. As Sigurd rode, the head bounced against his leg, its teeth scraping into his flesh, causing a wound that became infected. Days later, Sigurd was dead, not from battle, not from treachery, but because he accidentally let a dead man bite him. And then there was Emperor Valerian, whose death was so embarrassing that historians still wince when they describe it. The year was 260 AD, and Valerian had made a terrible mistake. He had lost a war to the Persian king, Shapur I, and worse, he had been taken prisoner. This was bad. Captivity was never kind to fallen rulers, but Shapur made sure Valerian's humiliation was eternal. Instead of executing him outright, Shapur used Valerian as his personal stepping stool, forcing him to kneel, so he could use his back as a platform to mount his horse. This continued until Valerian died, at which point his body was stuffed with straw and put on display as a permanent warning to other rulers who dared challenge Persia. It was not just death, it was a lifetime sentence of being used as furniture first. These kings were powerful, rulers of kingdoms, commanders of armies, shapers of history. And yet, when fate decided it was time for them to leave this world, they were defeated not by enemies, not by war, but by food, severed heads, and truly unfortunate public humiliation. Charles VI of France had everything a medieval king was supposed to have: power, wealth, armies at his command, and a kingdom that stretched across grand territories. But he also had something else: a deeply unfortunate and tragic belief that he was made entirely of glass and would shatter if touched. This was not just a passing paranoia. It consumed his daily life, shaped his rule, and left his court utterly bewildered, as they attempted to govern under a king who genuinely believed that one wrong move would reduce him to shards. And while his reign was filled with warfare, political chaos, and devastating consequences, it was his bizarre and tragic delusions that made him one of the most infamous rulers of medieval France. His troubles began early, when Charles took the throne in 1380. He was young, just 11 years old, which meant actual governance fell to regents and nobles eager to control the kingdom. By the time he was old enough to rule independently, France was in political turmoil. The 100 Years' War with England was still raging. His advisors were constantly manipulating the royal court, and financial disasters made ruling an absolute nightmare. It was enough to drive anyone into madness. Unfortunately for Charles, it did. At first, his episodes were sporadic, moments of erratic behavior and forgetfulness that people dismissed as mere exhaustion or bad decision-making. Then it got worse. One day, in 1392, Charles suddenly snapped. While leading his men through a forest, preparing for a military campaign, he lashed out unexpectedly, killing several of his own knights before anyone could stop him. When he finally calmed, he had no memory of what had just happened. This was not anger, nor was it treachery. It was the first recorded sign of his full descent into delusion. And then came his most infamous belief, that he was made entirely of glass. Charles became obsessed with the idea that his body was fragile, that one touch, one misstep, one wrong movement would leave him shattered beyond repair. The consequences were unbelievable. He refused to let people approach him, terrified that even a gentle brush against his arm would cause irreversible damage. He dressed in reinforced clothing, layers upon layers of thick fabric, all designed to protect his supposed glass-like form. Servants, nobles, military commanders, all had to navigate this impossible reality, pretending that this was fine when in truth, their kingdom was ruled by a man convinced that he was one bump away from breaking into pieces. And it didn't stop there. Charles went through extreme episodes, sometimes forgetting entirely that he was king. He would roam his palace in confusion, unrecognizing his own court, demanding to know who all these strangers were. At times, he believed he was not even human at all, convinced that he had transformed into something else entirely, his mind slipping further into the depths of medieval misunderstanding of mental illness. His court had no idea how to handle this. They couldn't replace him. He was still king. They couldn't confront his delusions. He would collapse further into paranoia. So instead, they did what medieval nobles always did in times of crisis. They schemed, maneuvered, and tried desperately to rule around the madness. As Charles fell deeper into delusion, France itself suffered. His inability to govern meant that rival factions fought endlessly for control, plunging the kingdom into civil war and devastation. The 100 Years' War dragged on, and French leadership fractured beyond repair. And while history recorded great battles, political betrayals, and shifting tides of power, no one could ignore the fact that at the heart of it all was a ruler so lost in delusion that he believed himself made of glass. His reign was a tragedy, and his death in 1422 left France in ruins. But what stands out more than any battle, treaty, or war is the deeply unfortunate reality of medieval mental illness. Had Charles lived in a time of modern medicine, perhaps he could have been treated, guided, and even saved. Instead, he lived in an era where mental illness was seen as weakness, possession, or punishment, and history remembers him not as a warrior king, but as the man who believed he would shatter if touched. After Charles VI's death in 1422, France was left broken, its leadership fractured, and its future uncertain. His reign had been a catastrophe, marked by instability, civil war, and a king so deeply lost in his own delusions that his court spent more time managing his paranoia than managing the kingdom itself. His death should have brought relief, a chance for France to finally recover from years of chaos. Instead, it only got worse, because his son, Charles III, inherited a kingdom on the verge of collapse. And worse still, England was ready to take everything. With France in ruins and its leadership still struggling to hold itself together, England saw an opportunity. Henry V of England had already dominated France on the battlefield, and the Treaty of Troyes, signed while Charles V was still alive, had declared that Henry and his heirs would inherit the French throne instead of Charles VI, which meant that, according to the treaty, Charles VI was not the true king. England was now in control. And France absolutely hated this. It wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about national survival. Charles V had one task: reclaim France and undo the damage caused by his father's disastrous reign. The problem? He was completely unprepared. At the start of his rule, he was weak, hesitant, and struggling to convince anyone that he deserved the crown. His army was outmatched. His support was unstable, and many French nobles considered abandoning him entirely. And yet, history had one final twist. Because in the midst of all this chaos, Joan of Arc arrived. Joan of Arc was exactly what France needed. A force of pure determination, belief, and absolute defiance in the face of English occupation. She was young, she was unexpected, and she did not care about the politics surrounding the throne. All she cared about was saving France, and against all odds, she did. Joan rallied the French forces, reclaimed lost territory, and single-handedly gave Charles VI the momentum he needed to fight back. Her success at Orléans in 1429 turned the tide of war, proving that France could win if they actually tried. And with her guidance, Charles VI was officially crowned king, undoing the humiliating Treaty of Troyes and restoring France's independence. The war dragged on, but now the French had the advantage. Joan of Arc had given them hope, and with time, Charles VI finally found his strength as a ruler. He reorganized France's army, reclaimed lost lands, and systematically pushed England out. By 1453, the 100 Years' War was over, and France had won. It had taken decades, an extraordinary military effort, and a young woman who refused to accept defeat. But in the end, France was whole again. Charles VI had left France in ruins. Charles VI had rebuilt it from the ground up. And while one king was remembered for madness, the other was remembered for survival. Medieval and early modern rulers had many ways to assert control over their subjects. Through laws, warfare, extreme fashion mandates, and sometimes truly bizarre taxation schemes that targeted personal grooming choices. And among the most infamous of these, the beard tax, a financial punishment for simply having facial hair. Because apparently, some kings had very strong opinions about beards, and the best way to enforce their questionable grooming standards was by making people pay for the privilege of looking hairy. Perhaps the most famous example of beard-related tyranny came from Peter the Great of Russia. Now, Peter was not just another monarch obsessed with absolute rule. He was a man on a mission to forcibly modernize his country, whether his subjects liked it or not. By the late 1600s, Western Europe had begun shifting away from the heavily bearded aesthetic, embracing clean, shaven faces as the new standard of sophistication. Peter wanted Russia to follow suit. But since asking politely was not exactly his leadership style, he opted for something more aggressive: a tax on beards. The rule was simple. If you wanted to keep your beard, you had to pay for it. Russian men now faced a choice: shave their facial hair to avoid financial punishment, or embrace the cost of being bearded. The tax was enforced with actual coins, meaning if you paid up, you would receive a special token proving that your facial hair was legally sanctioned. No token. You could be fined further, or worse, be forced to shave on the spot. Imagine walking through town, sporting a glorious medieval beard, only to be dragged aside by tax collectors who demand proof of payment for your majestic chin decoration. Peter was committed to this enforcement, because nothing says modernization quite like forcing people to shave for national progress. But Peter was not the only ruler obsessed with facial hair. Henry II of England, famous for having more wives than any royal court could reasonably keep track of, also flirted with the idea of taxing beards. Henry himself was a fan of extravagant facial hair, growing thick, well-maintained beards that became a symbol of masculinity and power. Naturally, he decided that if facial hair was going to be a sign of prestige, then only wealthy men should have it. And thus, he proposed a tax: beards to status, status to money. And if you were rich enough to afford a beard, then surely you could afford to pay for it. Meanwhile, Louis Gester of France went in the opposite direction entirely. He hated beards. Not disliked them, hated them with a burning passion. As far as Louis C. was concerned, facial hair was outdated, unsophisticated, and a direct assault on his vision of an elegant court. So instead of taxing them, he forced French men to shave. No beard. Fine. Bearded. Unacceptable. This led to an entire era of fashionable wigs and clean, shaven nobility, where men compensated for their lack of facial hair by wearing increasingly ridiculous hairstyles instead. Because if history has proven anything, it's that if you take away one source of excessive styling, people will find another. So what have we learned from all this? That kings loved dictating how people looked, and that beards were apparently serious political business. Some rulers forced their subjects to shave. Others made them pay to keep their facial hair. And in every case, the people had no choice but to obey, because arguing with a monarch over grooming taxes was never going to end well. Royal mandates were rarely sensible. In fact, history is filled with rulers who demanded the absolute strangest things from their subjects, issuing laws, taxes, and expectations that made no sense except in their own deeply questionable logic. If kings loved one thing, it was control, and sometimes that control extended into fashion, personal grooming, and wildly specific lifestyle choices. Take King Gustav III of Sweden, who attempted to ban coffee. Not regulate it, not tax it, just remove it from existence entirely. This was not a minor decision. Coffee was deeply popular across Sweden by the time Gustav III arrived. People loved it. They drank it constantly, and they had absolutely no desire to give it up, just because the king had a personal vendetta against morning energy. The logic behind the ban, no one knows. But Gustave was committed, enforcing restrictions on coffee drinking that, unsurprisingly, led to people drinking it in secret, like it was some forbidden substance, rather than just hot bean water. Naturally, this did not last. Because banning coffee was never going to end well, and Gustave's attempt at crushing caffeine dependence collapsed faster than his authority. And then there was Napoleon Bonaparte, who decided that everything in France needed to follow his personal taste, right down to the uniforms people wore. Napoleon had a very particular image of himself, and if something didn't match his aesthetic, it had to change. One of the strangest targets of this obsessive control: buttons. Napoleon hated coats that had decorative buttons, arranged in ways he found unnecessary. Specifically, he despised military coats with rows of buttons that stretched beyond the stomach. Why? Because soldiers, when standing idle with their arms crossed, often tucked their fingers into the top row of buttons, creating a posture that Napoleon found irritating and unsightly. His solution: redesign every coat to prevent excessive button rows entirely, ensuring that no soldier had the opportunity to pose in a way that personally offended his sense of style. Of course, no royal mandate was worse than the laws surrounding elaborate wigs. Medieval and early modern rulers were obsessed with hair, and when beards weren't the focus, wigs took center stage. Men could not just wear a simple wig. Oh no, it had to be ridiculous. Towering, powdered, filled with elaborate curls, all designed to look as unnatural as possible, while somehow still being fashionable. And then came the royal laws demanding that certain wigs had to be worn at official functions, meaning entire courtrooms were filled with men wearing what looked like gigantic cotton candy sculptures on their heads, all because a king had decided it was necessary. Were these practical? Absolutely not. Were they uncomfortable? Obviously. Did rulers care? Not even slightly. Royal demands rarely made sense, and even when they started with simple ideas, they often spiraled into absolute nonsense. Some kings hated coffee. Some kings made military coat buttons illegal. Some kings forced entire nations to wear wigs that defied reason. And all of it was somehow considered proper law. Royal mandates often started as simple ideas, but then spiraled into sheer insanity because monarchs refused to accept that their personal tastes weren't always the best governing strategy. Some rulers decided that entire nations should change their grooming habits, while others forced questionable fashion trends onto their courts. But sometimes, kings took things even further, introducing bans, taxes, and demands so absurd that their subjects had no choice but to obey, while secretly wondering if their ruler had lost all grip on reality. Consider King Charles VI of France, infamous for believing he was made entirely of glass. While his delusions created an unbearable ruling situation, his paranoia also extended into what his court could or couldn't do around him. He forbade people from touching him, convinced that one bump or misstep would shatter him into pieces. Servants had to carefully maneuver around their own king, ensuring they did not accidentally move too close or attempt anything that required direct physical contact. Instead of simply accepting that he was human, Charles insisted that his clothing be reinforced, hoping that layers of fabric would somehow prevent an imaginary glass body from breaking. This was not just a temporary belief, it lasted for years, and somehow, the kingdom kept running, which meant France was governed by a council that had to pretend that their ruler was a fragile glass figurine. at all times. If any medieval king proved that royal mandates could be ridiculous, it was Charles VI, because nothing says absolute monarchy quite like the literal refusal to acknowledge physical reality. And then there was King Philip IV of Spain, who had very strong opinions about dining etiquette. Philip was convinced that food should be consumed in absolute silence, meaning no conversation, no laughter, and certainly no enjoyment beyond the act of eating itself. Anyone caught speaking during royal meals, punished. The law extended beyond palace feasts, affecting noble households who had to adopt Philip's deeply questionable rules in their own dining traditions. Imagine sitting down to eat an extravagant meal, surrounded by courtiers in total silent misery, knowing that one accidental whisper could result in consequences. Philip, naturally, never questioned whether this was excessive, only that he must be obeyed, and that no dining room in Spain should suffer the indignity of casual conversation. But perhaps the most absurd royal rule in history belonged to Emperor Qin Shi Huang of China, who famously tried to outlaw death. Yes, death. The emperor, obsessed with immortality, demanded that his court avoid discussing death at all costs. Anyone who even mentioned the possibility of mortality could be severely punished. Because if nobody talked about it, surely it wouldn't happen. Unfortunately, biology is stubborn, and despite Qin Shi Huang's refusal to acknowledge death's existence, he still died. Which meant his empire had spent years pretending that something entirely inevitable was no longer real, only for history to prove otherwise. Royal demands were never simple, and they rarely made actual governing sense. Some rulers forbade death from being discussed. Some turned dinner into silent suffering. Some ruled over their nations while convinced they were made of glass. And in every case, their subjects had no choice but to accept these deeply ridiculous realities and hope that history would eventually correct them. Frederick Sicu of the Holy Roman Empire was not the kind of crusading king anyone expected. Most rulers who took up the cross to fight in the Crusades were fierce warriors, deeply committed to religious conquest, eager to expand their dominion by force. Frederick, however, preferred poetry and philosophy and science and diplomacy. Sure, he was technically a crusader, but when it came to war, he was far more interested in debating ideas than swinging swords. In fact, when he finally set off on the Sixth Crusade, he did something unheard of. He reclaimed Jerusalem without even fighting a battle. Frederick was a king of contradictions, a man who could balance brutal politics with refined intellectual pursuits, ruling an empire while also developing a personal obsession with literature, language, and the arts. He spoke multiple languages, corresponded with scholars across the known world, and even wrote poetry himself. Imagine the scene: a medieval ruler sitting in his court, overseeing an empire, engaging in diplomacy, all while composing elegant verses about love, nature, and philosophy. Frederick was supposed to be leading armies, crushing enemies, forcing his will upon the world through strength. But instead, he was having deep philosophical discussions about the meaning of existence. For medieval rulers, this was not normal behavior. Most kings loved war. Frederick, however, loved words. But no amount of poetry could protect him from the demands of the Crusades. As Holy Roman Emperor, he was expected to lead Christian forces against the Muslim world, reclaiming territory and fighting for the glory of Christendom. There was just one problem. Frederick had no interest in fighting. He agreed to launch a crusade, but when the time came, he delayed, stalled, made excuses, and avoided action as much as possible. At one point, the Pope excommunicated him, furious that he wasn't properly committing to the war effort. So, what did Frederick do? Did he launch a grand military campaign? Did he march with full force against the enemy? No, he negotiated. Through diplomacy alone, Frederick secured Jerusalem for the Christians. Without a single major battle, proving that sometimes a sharp mind is more effective than a sharp sword. Despite his successes, Frederick was never fully accepted as a traditional crusading hero. Other rulers saw him as too independent, too focused on intellectual pursuits, and not quite committed enough to war. His reign was filled with conflicts against the Pope, political battles within Europe, and moments where his love for philosophy made him appear more like a scholar than a monarch. He was brilliant, complex, and utterly different from the kings who came before him. And by the time he died in 1250, he had not only reshaped the Crusades, but had also left behind a legacy as one of the most fascinating rulers of medieval history. Frederick, too, may have been one of the most fascinating rulers of the medieval world, but his refusal to conform to the traditional expectations of a crusading king had consequences. He had secured Jerusalem through diplomacy rather than bloodshed, but instead of being hailed as a brilliant strategist, he was viewed with suspicion and frustration by those who had expected a full-scale military campaign. His conflicts with the papacy only worsened. Pope Gregory IX, already infuriated by Frederick's delays in launching the Sixth Crusade, was unwilling to forgive him, even after the peaceful acquisition of Jerusalem. Instead, he doubled down on his opposition, continuing Frederick's excommunication and openly declaring him an enemy of the Church. This led to one of the most dramatic political battles in medieval history. A war of words, military power, and outright defiance between an emperor who believed himself above the Pope and a Pope who refused to let an excommunicated ruler maintain his authority over Christendom. Frederick, never one to accept defeat, launched multiple campaigns to secure his rule, battling rebellious nobles in Italy and ensuring that his empire remained intact despite the papacy's efforts to undermine him. He was a ruler like no other, balancing intellectual pursuits with ruthless political tactics, proving that he could be both a philosopher and a warrior when necessary. But as the years wore on, his enemies multiplied. The papacy remained his most vocal opponent, but even within his own empire, nobles and rival factions plotted against him, sensing that his unconventional rule made him vulnerable. By the time of his death in 1250, Frederick had fought countless battles, not only on the battlefield, but in the political arena as well. He had transformed the nature of rulership, questioned long-standing traditions, and rewritten the expectations of what a king could be. His legacy, however, was complicated. To some, he was a visionary, a ruler who sought to merge the intellectual world with the realm of governance, proving that war was not always necessary for victory. To others, he was a traitor to the Crusades, a ruler who had defied papal authority, undermined religious warfare, and set a dangerous precedent by negotiating with the enemy instead of destroying them. And for many medieval scholars, he remains one of the most enigmatic figures in European history, a ruler who was at once a warrior, a poet, a diplomat, and a deeply controversial figure, shaping the fate of Christendom in ways that few had ever dared attempt before him. King Louis IX of France was one of the most remarkable rulers of medieval Europe. Unlike many of his predecessors who pursued war for conquest, ambition, or wealth, Louis IX waged war for faith. His commitment to the Crusades was not driven by political gain or territorial expansion. It was rooted in an unwavering belief that he was divinely chosen to defend Christianity in the East. His reign was defined by military campaigns, religious devotion, and an almost mythical sense of duty, culminating in the Seventh and Eighth Crusades, both of which were ambitious but ultimately disastrous. Despite his failures in battle, Louis IX became a saint, canonized in 1297 by Pope Boniface V, and remains one of the most fascinating medieval monarchs. His legacy, however, is complicated. The Seventh Crusade, a 1248-1254, was Louis's first attempt at reclaiming the Holy Land. Unlike the earlier Crusades, which focused on Jerusalem, Louis turned his attention to Egypt, believing that controlling Egyptian territory would provide a strong base for future Christian expansion. He assembled a massive army, well funded and carefully planned, and set sail for the Middle East with full confidence in his mission. His forces landed in Egypt in 1249, quickly capturing Damietta, a vital port city on the Nile. The initial victory gave Crusaders hope, but the success was short-lived. As Louis's army marched toward Cairo, it faced immense difficulties. Flooded roads, logistical failures, and supply shortages made the campaign nearly impossible. Then, disaster struck. The Crusaders engaged the Egyptian forces at the Battle of al-Mansura, and what had started as a carefully planned campaign turned into absolute chaos. The French forces suffered heavy casualties, overwhelmed by the Egyptian army's superior tactics and reinforcements. Louis refused to abandon the fight, but his resistance only led to further losses. In April 1250, the unthinkable happened. King Louis IX was captured. The ruler of France, one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe, was dragged into captivity, held prisoner by the Egyptian forces, and humiliated on the battlefield. The crusade had failed, and Louis had no choice but to negotiate for his freedom. After paying a massive ransom, he was released, but his defeat in Egypt left a deep wound in the Crusader movement. His troops withdrew, and the Seventh Crusade ended not with victory, but with absolute failure. Louis, however, did not give up. Despite his military humiliation, he remained devoted to the idea of reclaiming the Holy Land, refusing to accept that his mission had failed. Nearly 20 years later, in 1270, he launched the Eighth Crusade, setting sail once again for the Middle East, determined to restore Christian control. This time, however, his campaign made even less sense. Instead of heading directly for Jerusalem or Egypt, he chose to attack Tunis, believing that controlling the North African region would serve as a gateway for future conquests. It was a massive miscalculation. Tunis was not the key to Jerusalem, and his forces were completely unprepared for the conditions. Then, plague struck the Crusaders. His army, weakened by disease, began collapsing, and soon even Louis IX himself fell ill. By August 1270, the king who had once led thousands of warriors into battle was dead, overcome by sickness in a foreign land. The Eighth Crusade ended before it even truly began, and Louis IX's dream of reclaiming the Holy Land was buried with him. Despite his failures, Louis IX remains one of the most famous figures of medieval France, a king who believed his cause was just, even when reality proved otherwise. His unwavering faith, his military ambition, and his tragic defeats on the battlefield shaped the course of Crusader history. And even though his campaigns ended in failure, the Catholic Church saw his devotion as evidence of sainthood, ensuring that he would be remembered not just as a warrior king, but as a divine ruler. Frederick Sevin may have passed, but his legacy refused to die quietly. His unconventional approach to rule, his defiance of the papacy, and his ability to negotiate victories instead of simply waging war, left behind an empire that was deeply uncertain about its future. his successors faced a nearly impossible challenge: maintaining control over lands that had thrived under Frederick's iron grip, but now lacked his singular authority. With the Holy Roman Empire fractured, rival factions immediately moved to claim power. The papacy, still furious about Frederick's rebellion, saw an opportunity to finally weaken the imperial throne. Excommunications, political scheming, and outright warfare followed in the years after his death, ensuring that his empire would never truly recover its former strength. His son, Conrad IV, inherited the throne but had little time to rule before his own untimely death in 1254. With no strong successor, the empire plunged into chaos, entering what historians call the interregnum, a period where no ruler could truly claim undisputed authority. The Holy Roman Empire became a battlefield, with rival nobles fighting for dominance, the papacy working tirelessly to undermine imperial rule, and Frederick's former territories gradually slipping from imperial control. Frederick had once commanded an empire that stretched across Italy, Germany, and beyond, but without him, it began to crumble. And yet, Frederick's intellectual legacy remained. Even as his empire fractured, his influence on art, philosophy, and governance refused to fade. His fascination with science and poetry ensured that future generations of scholars looked back on him, not as just another medieval king, but as a ruler who defied expectations. Where other monarchs had focused solely on conquest, Frederick had built an empire where knowledge flourished, proving that a ruler could be both a warrior and a philosopher, even if the world wasn't quite ready for someone like him. By the time the empire stabilized decades later, Frederick was remembered as a ruler unlike any other, a man who had challenged the status quo, infuriated the church, and somehow led a crusade without ever raising his sword in battle. To rule was not to live in luxury, it was to endure. We see the golden crowns, the towering castles, the opulent feasts. Imagining a life of grandeur without burden, we picture kings standing tall in court, draped in velvet, and adorned with jewels, their names written into history as legends of power. But behind the throne was a reality far less enviable, far more suffocating. Every king bore the weight of expectation, the crushing pressure of rule. Wars demanded their presence. Nobles plotted their downfall. The very people they governed whispered rebellion at the slightest sign of weakness. Sleep was a privilege. Trust was an illusion. Privacy was non-existent. There was no room for failure, no space for doubt. Only the relentless duty to rule and survive. Some kings lived in constant paranoia, unsure if the next meal would be poisoned, if the next embrace from family would be their last. Some went mad beneath the weight of their crown, their minds fracturing under the unending pressure, lost to delusions that turned their own courts into prisons. Some had their fates sealed by a single mistake, a single miscalculation, watching as their own people turned against them, as their names were dragged through history not as rulers but as cautionary tales. We remember the victories, we remember the conquests, but we forget the exhaustion, the loneliness, the crushing responsibility. Kings did not rule for pleasure, they ruled because they had no choice. And if history has proven anything, it is that no throne, no crown, no empire ever came without suffering. Perhaps it is easy to envy kings, but to live like one, few would survive it. And so we close another chapter of history, where kings rose and fell, empires clashed, and legacies were forged in the fires of power and survival. But behind every throne was a life filled with hardship, burden, and impossible choices. For all their grandeur, these rulers walked a path few would dare tread, carrying the weight of entire nations on their shoulders. Here, we explore not just the victories, but the struggles, the battles fought beyond the battlefield, the pressures that shaped their reigns, and the moments that revealed the true cost of ruling. Thank you for joining this journey through history. A place where power was never just privilege, but a relentless test of endurance. And as always, there's more to uncover, more tales to tell, more secrets to reveal. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and remember, history is never just what it seems.